There's an ongoing deliberation about what ought to lead us in the decision-making process. Some argue that we should follow our heads. That is, that we should make sure that our decisions are rational, that we put them through a thinking and planning process. But others argue that that's boring and it takes too long and it's no fun. They say that instead we should follow our heart. We should go with our passions and our urges, be spontaneous, and do whatever our heart desires. That debate has inspired a series of cartoons authored by a man by the name of Nick Seeluck. His book of those cartoons actually made the New York Times bestseller list. He graciously on his website allows nonprofit organizations to use his material freely. And so I have selected a few of those cartoons this morning to illustrate to you this struggle between following our heart versus following our head. This first one kind of defines the issue there on the left. The head will lead us on a path of responsibility, while the heart will just chase foolish fantasies. And we often find ourselves at that crossroads, don't we? Not knowing which way to go. Feeling one thing, but knowing another. And so there's the conflict. And sometimes it is that our heart takes control and pulls our head along, dragging it through the mud in the process. Some of his cartoons show specifics of the decisions that we sometimes struggle with, head versus heart. Like this next one. The heart wants what it wants. Donuts and chocolate cake and pizza and candy. The head asks, what are you doing? Because that's not healthy for the body. But the heart says, don't worry, we exercised last month. How many of you have had that struggle? I have had that struggle. It probably doesn't take much of a look for you to determine which organ often wins out in my case. Maybe you can identify. In this next frame, the heart says, free shipping if we spend $75, but the head argues, we're not spending another $73 to get free shipping. Don't raise your hands because it's too embarrassing, but how many of you have had that struggle between heart and head? This next cartoon shows the heart wanting a triple dip ice cream cone and the head trying to reason, but the heart will not be reasoned with. Do you want cholesterol? Because that's how you get cholesterol. I do want that. Because the heart wants everything. As this next cartoon clip shows, as the heart's chasing another fantasy, the head giving up almost. You never give up, do you? No way, the heart says. There's always something worth chasing, and that defines the heart, leading us after on one fantasy pursuit after another. And then in a moment of honesty, perhaps, the author gives us a cartoon to end this illustration with, and the heart saying to the head, I'd be a disaster without you. Yes, you would. In an article in the HuffPost, psychologist Dr. Nikki Martinez suggested that we should all follow our hearts. She wrote, when you follow your heart, you cease having regrets. Really? Is that true? A young lady falls for a handsome young man with a charming smile. Her friends warn her that he drinks too much, but she defends him, saying that he only spends so much time in the bars because he's single and he has nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. She reasons that marriage will give him a sense of purpose and will settle him down. Why does she ignore the warning signs? It's because he has won her heart. After they are married, she realizes he is an alcoholic. And their marriage goes into self-destruct mode. Don't you think she regrets then that she followed her heart instead of her head? In that same article, Dr. Martinez wrote that when we follow our hearts, we are, and I quote, ensured that we are on the right and true path. Boy, that is just not the case. She believes it is, and so she encourages us, listen to your heart. It knows your true desires and what will genuinely make you fulfilled. But what does the Bible imply about following our heart when it tells us things like what we read in Jeremiah 17:9? The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? When we are following our heart, we are headed the wrong direction. The Bible mentions the word heart over 300 times. And in nearly every one of those references, it isn't talking about the organ that pumps blood, but about the center of our desires and passions. And the Bible's primary message about that heart is that it is untrustworthy as a guide in its natural state. In fact, Jesus said this about the heart of natural man in Mark 7, verses 21 through 23. It is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. Does that sound like the kind of leadership we should follow? Aristotle wrote much about following the passions of the heart. One of the Greek words he used for passions is the word pathos, from which we get our English word pathetic. That tells us something, doesn't it? When Cicero translated Aristotle's works into the Latin, he struggled with how best to convey the thought that Aristotle intended when he used that word pathos, that word for passion. For pathos can be an illness, as in our word pathology, the study of illnesses, or psychopath, a sick soul. And so Cicero came to understand that our passions have to be governed. Otherwise, they will destroy us. That belief is consistent with what the Bible teaches about following our heart. The Bible defines pathos, our passions, as raw, strong desires and lusts which are not guided by God. And so, to follow our heart is to serve the God of our desires. There's an Old Testament character whose life stands as a perfect example of what we are describing. His name was Samson, and you probably are familiar with at least some of his life. He is a perfect example of what not to do. You may know of Samson as being the strongest man in the Bible. But in reality, he was actually very weak because he followed his heart. His story teaches us that desire often begins with our eyes. Ironically, we can be blinded by our vision. For our eyes collaborate with our heart to serve our desires. Our heart's desire usually begins with some sort of visual attraction. We see something we like, we yearn for it, and our desires take over. That was Samson's experience. Samson was born to an infertile couple. God gave that conception as a miracle because he had a plan for Samson's life. Samson was born for a specific purpose, to deliver his people Israel from oppression. Israel was subjected to Philistine rule for 4 decades. And God gave Samson miraculous life and miraculous strength so he could lead Israel to victory over their oppressors. Therefore, Samson's life was to be committed to God's purposes. His life was to be a holy life, reflecting the holy nature of God. His holy life was to be a testimony to the God he served. But when Samson became a young man, he began to serve the God of his desires instead. And his desires began in his eyes. We see an example of that in part of the story of Samson found in Judges chapter 14, the first 2 verses. Samson went down to Timnah and saw a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." The Philistines, remember, were the enemies of Israel. Samson was born in order to lead Israel in victory over their enemies, their oppressors. But Samson's falling in love with one because she looked good to him. His parents protested. As we see in verse 3 in the Contemporary English version, his parents answered, "There are a lot of women in our clan, and even more in the rest of Israel. Those Philistines are pagans. Why would you want to marry one of their women?" Samson answered, "She looks good to me. Get her for me." His desire was fueled by his sight, and it led to an indulgence that he was not permitted to have. He married that girl. But the marriage quickly fell apart, as the scriptures tell us. And through that whole negative process, Samson learned absolutely nothing. For he continued the rest of his life seeing and wanting and getting. We see another example of that in Judges 16, verse 1, when it says, "One day Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went to spend the night with her." Samson was not the only person whose eyes were the gateway to sin. Eve gave in to Satan's temptations to disobey God because, as the text tells us, the fruit was pleasing to her eyes. David committed an unthinkable sin, adultery, and then attempted to cover it up with an even worse sin, murder, because the scriptures tells us he watched her taking a bath. Solomon testified in the book of Ecclesiastes that as he began his journey deep into sin, he dedicated to himself everything his eyes desired. The Apostle John warns us in 1 John chapter 2 to resist the lust of the eyes. Job made this covenant with his eyes, this vow, as recorded in Job 31:1. "I promised myself never to stare with desire at a young woman." Jesus advised, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. He reasoned it would be better for you to lose one body part than for your entire body to be led into sin and therefore to cast into hell. That advice is not to be taken literally, by the way. You understand the point Jesus was making and the point of these scriptures, and that is to beware of the desire of our eyes. Don't we struggle with that? Seeing, wanting, getting, trying to get at least. Advertisers know that we do, and they take advantage of it. For example, there might be there's a company that and every company does this to some extent, but one that really hits home with me, maybe you as well. They will post pictures on billboards along the highway, on our TV screens, and of these big, juicy quarter pounders, and we see a picture of that, and I mean, look at that extra cheese, and look how thick that meat patty is, and what a generous helping of toppings on top of that. I mean, it just looks amazing. Your mouth is probably watering right now. But when we order the sandwich, this is what we really get. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it never measures up to the photograph, does it? And we know that. And yet we will return and place an order for that quarter pounder again and again because our heart wants what our eyes see. That desire has been placed within us. And we struggle with the desire of our eyes. Men typically do more than females. Men are visually oriented and visually stimulated. And therefore many men struggle with looking at pretty women. Okay, I just told a lie. All men struggle with looking at pretty women. Here's my advice to you guys. When you are talking to a lady who is wearing a provocative outfit, maintain good eye contact. You know what I'm talking about, right? Don't let your eyes wander. It's not going to lead anywhere good. And here's my advice to you ladies. Don't wear clothing like that. We don't need any help noticing you. You can wear an old feed sack and we'd still take a second look. Because men are drawn to the feminine form. We have the same problem Samson did. All men do. That's why Job wrote, I had to make a covenant with my eyes not to look at a young woman with desire. God judged Samson's eyes. Do you remember how his life turned out? He so was attracted to a Philistine beauty named Delilah that he told her the secret of his strength, and she used it against him. She sold that information to Philistine soldiers, and they used it to weaken Samson and tie him up. And what was the first thing they did after they captured him? They put out his eyes. They put out his eyes. I don't believe that was Philistine punishment as much as it was the judgment of God. And there's a lesson in that for us. The life lived serving the God of my desires will be judged. Our dog loves to roll in manure, especially if it's fresh. Our chicken's free range, so there's no shortage of fresh manure on our property. But what our dog really loves is visiting the two horses next door. Their 5-acre pasture is full of big piles of fresh manure. If this offends your sensibilities, you might want to cover your ears now. Since none of you are, I'll assume that you are as twisted as I am, and you want to hear the rest of this illustration. When our dog is finished rolling in the manure to her heart's content, she avoids us. She knows that she's in trouble. And that demonstrates to me that she knows it's the wrong thing to do. So my question is, why doesn't she stop when she sees a pile of manure and reason, Mom and Dad aren't going to be happy if I do this. They're going to yell at me and spank me. They're going to give me 2 or 3 baths, and I hate baths. And then they're going to make me stay in the garage for a few hours, and I won't get any treats for the rest of the day. I should just walk away from this. But she doesn't. She follows her heart instead of her head. Poop! I love poop! I want it all over me! She follows her heart and dives right in. She'll worry about the consequences later. How many of us are just like that dog? We see something we really want, and without stopping to think about it, without thinking about the subsequent consequences, we follow our heart and dive right in. Is it any wonder our life sometimes stinks? Aren't we supposed to rise above our animal instincts? Isn't that what it means to be a human created in the image of God? Our eyes will lead us into sin, but the real problem lies in our hearts. Samson's continual pattern of life was to see and to want and to get, and he broke God's laws in order to do so. He followed his heart to obtain his desires. And that has become the mantra of our contemporary culture. Follow your heart. If it feels good, do it. Do your own thing, whatever turns you on. But is that what we really want? A society structured by those values? People doing whatever feels good to them, whatever turns them on? Wasn't Jeffrey Dahmer just following his heart when he killed and cannibalized 17 men in the 1980s? Wasn't Ariel Castro merely doing what turned him on, when he kidnapped 3 girls from Cleveland and chained them in his home to be his own personal sex slave for a few years in the early 2000s? Wasn't Stephen Paddock just doing his own thing when he shot and killed 59 people who were attending a street concert in the city of Las Vegas in 2017? Should a responsible society really encourage people to follow your heart? We are called to follow God's will. It's a call to holiness. Samson took a Nazirite vow. That vow meant that he, among other things, he could not cut his hair, he could not drink intoxicating beverages, he could not touch an unclean thing, he could not affiliate with unclean people like the Philistines. He was to live his life as a holy person. As a leader in Israel, he represented God to the nation. In a similar way, as Christians, we too represent God to our nation. And we also are called to live in holiness. 1 Peter 2:9 tells us, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation." This is to Christians he's writing, not to the Jewish people. God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Holiness is a good thing. Some believe that holiness is a burden. I have a friend who believes that Christians can't have any fun, and he looks down his nose at Christianity because of its restrictive laws. And yet in his unrestricted life, I notice that he is not a happy person. He complains often. He has a negative outlook. In comparison, I believe I am a happy person. I feel greatly blessed. And the reason is because holiness leads to a better life. It leads to a better life here in this world, free from the problems that many suffer as a result of following their heart. And it leads to a better life in eternity, a life of joy and laughter and blessings and great reward. A life lived in a place so beautiful, words are not enough to describe it for all eternity. We are called to follow God's will to his place of eternity for us. And it's really a call to the fulfillment of our purpose. Samson was created to be a holy warrior, a defender of the nation of Israel, a godly leader. But he became none of those things. When he should have been out scouting troops, he was out scoping chicks. When he should have been engaging the enemy, he was becoming engaged to one. Instead of fighting, he was fraternizing. Instead of plotting war, he was planning a wedding. Instead of both battling successfully, he was bartering for sex. Oh, he carried on an impressive lifelong personal feud against the Philistine army, but he never led Israel to victory. And as a result, for the next 80 years, Israel remained oppressed by the Philistines until God raised up a real holy warrior named David. He was not a strong man, but a faithful boy. He followed God's leading for his life, despite a few times that he fell throughout his life. He was called a man after God's heart because he did not follow his own. God calls us to that purpose. Not to follow our own heart, but to follow his will. And we need to be reminded, perhaps often, of the truth stated in Proverbs 19:21, which says, "Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails." Samson died in failure because he lived by this world's philosophy. You live in success by living faithfully to God's will. If you commit your life to that, then God has a promise for you, a promise of a new heart. A promise that would begin to be fulfilled in the life of the Messiah when he was to be born, and would be fulfilled throughout the ages of the kingdom of that Messiah, the church age. That promise is found in Ezekiel 36:26, when God promised, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. And so God issues that invitation this morning to open your heart to him, to have your heart transformed, to receive his Holy Spirit living in you, and to follow his plan for your life. It leads to a better life here and to a far better one in eternity.